Well, hello, listeners, and welcome back to the Purposeful Marketing Podcast. Aaron and James here. I will say Mary could not join us today, but she's in our hearts. And specifically, this topic is one she wanted to discuss, but James and I are going to take it away, and hopefully she can add something in the comments. So, what are James and I going to talk about today? It's a tactic we've mentioned a couple times in different episodes, but we really wanted to break it down. What is repurposing content and where does it go wrong? To kick us off, I just wanted to kind of tackle this idea and then let James have the floor to speak to it as well. But there is something really meta about this question here. What is repurposing content? It's kind of what we're doing right now and how we practice that and how we preach it. There's a reason why we chose a podcast. And mainly the reason was you get an audio file, you get a video file, we get a written transcript. Now we have 3 pieces of content that we can take and we can put in other places. You actually see us do this. The place we put it most is on LinkedIn. I just had a post today taking a video and the audio from one of our episodes and promoted it out to the LinkedIn network. That is repurposing content in a nutshell. It's not something complicated. It doesn't have to be so robust. It's really just taking what you have, distributing it in other places, and hopefully improving it along the way. So before we dive a little deeper into that idea, James, I just want to give you the floor. Repurposing content, your thoughts. Where does it go wrong?
Well, I think I can think easily of where it goes wrong, and where it would go wrong is if when you said you posted with some content from this podcast on LinkedIn, and that some content from this podcast on LinkedIn was just the podcast, the entire podcast. I think it goes wrong when people kind of ignore the fact that, what's great for one channel is not great for every channel. And it's understandable how people make that mistake because, for some people, the why of repurposing is, well, because it allows me to ship more content with less work. And yeah, there's a great case for repurposing content or redistributing content if that's your why. But it leads to sloppiness, I think. Like if that's the reason that you're doing something, it kind of feels like you're optimizing a process. You're creating a process for efficiency, not for quality. When you could create a process for quality and then optimize it over time. Instead, the easy way is to just think of a process that would allow you to check things off, your checklist as fast as possible. So I think that's like where it goes wrong is say you develop pillar content or, any content and you think like, oh, more people need to see this. The best way to do that is to just throw it into another channel without thinking about, how what's valuable in one channel can become valuable in another with some amount of effort. But yeah, I think that's primarily like really what goes wrong is just people not, again, forgetting that even though repurposing content is something that's really beneficial for you as a marketer, you should be doing it in a way that's beneficial for your customer.
Yeah, and I think the piece I'm going to linger on and to really articulate this more clearly, and I love the old way versus new way. The old way with repurposing content is exactly what you laid out, James, is like where it goes wrong is I wrote a blog article. Now I'm going to post it on Twitter. I'm going to post it on Instagram, post it on LinkedIn. Done. I repurposed the content. That's the old way. The new way does put the customer in the frame of mind. Because again, we don't just want to repost that content. We want to repurpose it for the customer, how they want to digest it. So again, the podcast is a great example because it gives us 3 content formats that we can now go distribute and promote on those channels in different ways. So for instance, again, you're going to get the audio from our podcast, people who are listening to podcasts on Spotify, that's how they want to digest that content. Now, when they go on social media, it's either the written word or preferably now I think they want to watch the videos. Great, we have the video. Let's go repurpose it on LinkedIn, write new copy for it, make sure it fits the feed in the right way and how the channel uses the content. That's the new way. That's repurposing content. And again, the why to that is making the content fit the way the customer wants it most. So I think there's just something so important into that as to why you need to avoid just kind of reposting it, and why we're intentionally using the word repurposing. Because I think repurposing also has some intention to improve it, to make it better. Do you have any thoughts on that? The whole intention behind repurposing?
Yeah. And I like what you said about, your intent, is something you can leverage to make the content better. Like, I think it's helpful. Like we go ahead and record this podcast. I haven't really used it at all to like generate micro content or use it in any other way, to actively promote or market. But you have. Well, when you go about doing that, like that's an opportunity for you to improve on something. Like we are just ripping this thing off. I mean, there's no prep call for this. When you go to post on LinkedIn, and repurpose, whether it be an idea that we talked about here, that you've got a transcript of a couple of us talking about something, or it's, just a straight video clip of one of us talking, like you have the opportunity to like supplement what we originally did and make it something, one, better for the channel, but just maybe two, better in general. Like again, just because the seductive idea of repurposing content is, oh my God, it's the easiest way to be present on multiple channels, or to, it's the easiest way to get in front of the most amount of people. It's the easiest, doesn't mean that the best way to get the most out of it isn't to do it the hardest way or to give it the most thought. I think because you're always going to get the most bang for your buck that way in terms of like your time. It's like, yes, it's a lot easier than being really thoughtful on LinkedIn in a way that's totally separate from this podcast where we're thoughtful and we put our time in and we show up every week. Yeah, but it's not going to be a cakewalk. Like, you just gotta, I think that, we talk about this all the time where it's like, you have to care. And I think that to kind of like switch gears, I think it's like obvious, the benefits of repurposing from a sense of like your process and what it allows you to do, the tools that are at your disposal when you have a pillar of content and you can kind of pull from that and throw it here, throw it there. And you've got all your tactics down, how you're going to use all those channels. Like it's obvious the benefits. But what about like maybe the how, like, are there like mechanical things, that you've got to worry about? Like when you're chopping up micro content from this podcast, like, are there mechanical challenges? Like what's like need to know for someone who's going to try and start doing this?
That's such a great question. And then once we do this, let's follow up with how we get our clients to do it as well, because I think that's where we're going. The needs to know is, I want to start with this, which is going back to intention and caring. We don't plan out all the micro content and repurposing, and the content waterfall would be a terminology to use with this podcast. As James alluded to, the number one variable that works for us every time is just showing up at this time of recording. But when you're ready to repurpose, that's where care and intention comes in. That's going to be your mindset to, when I take this micro clip and I need to put it on LinkedIn, I need to write it for the platform. needs to be a little bit long form. I need to speak the LinkedIn speak. I need to talk directly to my customers on the platform. That care and attention is probably going to lead you farther than let's plan out a bunch of micro clips throughout the whole year and execute on them. I think it's a combination of showing up, thinking about what your customers need and when they need it. And honestly, those two things are probably going to drive you in your micro content, your repurposing content, more than here's my editorial calendar for the entire year of how I'm going to do this. I want to let you comment on that before I move on to my second point, James.
I'm glad you put it that way, because you do kind of get the idea sometimes that when you're trying to plan something, especially because you mentioned like clients, when you're trying to set up a plan and talk about when are you going to see results, when are you going to do, there's like the temptation to like plan like way out in advance, and it's a hard thing to do with micro content. You set yourself up for failure, I think, because the way we work at Gorilla a lot of times is we're talking with a subject matter expert. That's the pillar content, is like a conversation with the subject matter expert. That's our starting point. We use that to generate blog content, advertisements, like ad copy, but also sometimes videos or recordings or audiograms. But like, if I go into that interview with the subject matter expert and I go into that interview with the interest in creating micro content, like I probably will get good. I'll get good micro content. Like if I was like, oh, I want an audiogram. Well, I'll get a good audiogram. But there's a stopping point there, because what's that audiogram supposed to do? Like a lot of times it's just supposed to generate interest or tease the like we're talking about deep stuff. Like a 2-minute video isn't going to cut it. I need something more dense, but that dense product that I was going to create, I didn't get, because I spent an hour trying to get the perfect micro content in the interview. Like, it is important to do the thing that you're doing now and doing it and do it well, versus, I'm doing this interview and I would just love to get like X quote, I would love to. And it just ruins my ability to create the product that I'm actually sitting down to create at that moment. So I am glad you mentioned that, because it seems like that's an easy trap to fall into if you kind of lose focus on the fact that, this is one tactic of many. And when you develop the muscle for executing this tactic, you don't need to set yourself up by changing every other thing that you do. You just need to like keep your eye on the prize, and it just works that way. In terms of like mechanically kind of like getting this engine rolling for clients, I feel like the biggest struggle, like from an agency and client perspective, is like you're two different teams on two different schedules. It's so hard to like have conversations about like priorities, and like a lot of times, your contact is someone who isn't just in marketing. Maybe they've got like business level responsibilities, they're in operations, like whatever. So it's like really showing up becomes the hard part. Like the hardest thing to start doing is getting consistent and committed enough to generate all the content in the first place. The repurposing is the easy part, but you'll run out of stuff to repurpose really, really quickly if you're trying to run like constant advertisements, if you're trying to create really consistent like newsletter content. I mean, like if you want to be consistent and create a high volume of content, repurposing isn't going to get you there unless you're creating a lot of starting point content. And that really requires like showing up. If it's a podcast, that might be all it requires, depending. But in other cases, it might require quite a lot more. It might require, a lot of time with engineers. It might require a decent amount of scheduling time with those engineers. But I think that's actually the hard part. That's the challenge. Especially when you're working with like disparate organizations, people that work internally, I'm sure that's still a struggle, in terms of getting people's time, like getting people to commit to something. I wonder if you have any like tips for kind of either internal or client facing, but like how to get like the ball rolling consistently so that you can generate like mountains worth of content.
This is such a great question, James, and I'll start to deconstruct it. Is the first challenge is what you were describing first, is like, don't pull the cart before the horse. So we can't just start off, the first thing we do is make micro clips, right? We really need to put that effort into content pillar. Something we talked about last episode is, can we just show up at this time and produce this type of content and then repurpose that content along the way? I think that's what you have to tackle first. If you're in-house or you're on the agency side working with a client, can we establish that content pillar, that time where we show up and make content? Now, at a certain point, though, you have to articulate to your stakeholders why repurposing matters. I think that's a much harder challenge. How I would tackle it is, and this is where Mary would add the strategist point of view here, is this content pillar and the repurposing, it should all speak to the overall strategy of your marketing program. I think for most of our listeners, the marketing program is going to adopt some demand gen strategy and tactics, right? So if that's the case, we need to produce content, provide education and value in the feed, offer insights free. Again, what we're really talking about is really creating content organically that our customers want most. If that's the case, repurposing fits right in there. Content pillar fits right in there. But what's the hard job of the strategist, or let's say the marketing director and in-house, is articulating that to stakeholders and making sure they understand why we're doing this. So I think it's a little bit storytelling. It's essentially, here's our strategic narrative. We have to get it out here this year. We have to distribute. Distribute's a big word with this, with repurposing and a content pillar, is getting it to the right people at the right time. So you have to tell that story. Then I think what you have to do is start to create a process, or a touch point where this repurposing becomes just part of your marketing program over time. I think for in-house, that may work its way into just having a touch point where it's a rapid improvement workshop. Once a quarter, we go through our content, we think about it, and we improve it. I think on the agency side, particularly because I know Gorilla 76 and Proofpoint, how we work with customers is, we're going to help develop their whole marketing plan. And then we're going to try to achieve that, is you need to have these touch points all the time of, if we're going to make this repurposing content, it needs to speak to the overall strategy and goal. And that, that's hard. I'm not going to say that's easy or there's like a process or system to make that happen. But what does happen, and we're doing this now as we start to move our podcast in different channels and we start to repurpose in different ways, you start to feel the effect. Customers are going to start commenting on your content in different ways. They're going to follow you on different platforms. They're going to engage with you differently depending on the content type and how you repurposed it. That waterfall effect is going to happen, right? And so if you do this the right way and you just keep going, you're going to see it. It's going to be validated through that qualitative analysis. And I can give more tips and insights on that. But really the two things I kind of spoke about is really being able to tell a story and then kind of committing to it and then seeing it play through. You have any thoughts on that, James?
Yeah, I think that's super helpful. And I think my maybe personal experience with a client in particular was that they wanted the pillar. They wanted the pillar for a particular reason. And as the strategy evolved, and really, like, you know, they became interested in more sophisticated marketing that kind of aligned with what Gorilla does for more of our clients. It became a thing like, well, you know, we've got this, you're generating all of this thought leadership, all of this, you know, expert level content. People are eating it up. People are really, really enjoying it. But it's happening once a month, you know? It's like you're really spreading out the amount that you get in front of people. And it did not take long, you know, and also, you know, when we suggested, you know, let's create micro content and help you get active organically on social media to kind of spread the ideas of the podcast throughout the month, not just once a month. They had an easy time getting behind that because at that point, they just loved the pillar. Mm-hmm. You know, the pillar was great and they loved it. It was fun. It aligned with everything they felt about their company. And it was working. It was doing its job already. So having that buy-in already made it easy to pitch, you know, what if we did this? But it also, I mean, probably not in all cases does it so quickly prove itself out to be valuable. I mean, it did not take long for it to be obvious that, like, oh my God, this was an amazing idea. Because what happens is, instead of reaching the 1,200 people that listen to the podcast, I mean, you look at the LinkedIn post and it's like 14,000 impressions. What? So like you just 7x'd the amount of people that view your content. And you all of a sudden start to see, like, for the past 6 months since we've been doing this, back and forth, they feed into each other. It's like, ever since the micro content starts taking off, way more people are listening to the podcast. As more people start listening to the podcast, you know, you generate more valuable ideas, you get more feedback. In LinkedIn, you know, you start getting questions from audience members that you can answer. You get topic ideas for the podcast that you wouldn't have had. I think there's an amount that, like, there's an evolution there that, I mean, I think at this point, like, that engine is just moving for them. And I think it also speaks to the idea that, like, they're not doing that podcast to create micro content. They're doing that podcast to have a great podcast. Some of the micro content isn't even in the published podcast. It's other conversations that are happening that I edit out. Like, oh, this doesn't make sense in audio, but we've got a cool, like, the visual tells the story here and we're going to make a video out of this. So, like, there's that element. And it really just, like, it should appeal to anyone who's really busy that you're working with. Like, if you want your CEO to be engaged on social media, but they don't want to do it, and you already have this pillar content that they're helping you produce, like, ask them for the keys to the social media Cadillac. I mean, like, because I'm sure that they wish that they were reaching the people that they could reach, you know? And it's just a way to do it. Like, not everyone in someone's audience is going to want to consume the pillar. But a lot of those people that don't want to consume the pillar would want to consume the micro content or the repurposed content. So, I mean, I think that kind of story for how someone would be engaged or how that engine moves is really valuable. That was so long-winded. But maybe a question to change the subject again is, like, how is this idea valuable, like, internally? Like, the idea that the things that we create aren't complete the moment that we distribute it on whatever channel it was created for. Like, how does that concept and way of thinking kind of reverberate?
It's a great question, James. I do want to pull one insight that you said, because I think it's very important, and I was not thinking about it when we were originally discussing this topic. One of the best insights I think from this episode is if you have a content pillar that works, repurposing is not even a challenge. I know the client you're speaking of, and I know when they started the content pillar, it wasn't that it was going to work when they started it, or that we're going to create micro content or repurpose content out of this content pillar. It started with they had this idea to do it. They did it. Some of their customers loved it. They got some feedback. They kept doing it for a long time. And now they're getting that amplification. And now those activities to do the repurposing content feel a part of the process. I think that's really what we need to advocate here is, if you have a content pillar, or essentially, if you like making content, just do it. And then the repurposing stuff will come later. Where it really goes wrong, now that I'm thinking about it, is when you start to make a piece of content with repurposing in mind in the beginning. Essentially, you're saying, we haven't figured out the piece of content yet, but we're going to slice and dice it in different ways and distribute and amplify it. You have to figure the content out first, and you have to commit and stay there for a long time to understand if it works. I'll give another example besides podcasting, which we don't talk about SEO a lot on our podcast here, but the reason why it doesn't work is because people don't commit to it long enough to do it. However, that is definitely a traditional channel where you write a blog, you repurpose that content, you write a new blog, you keep improving that over time. That's the most straightforward example of this process we're talking about. And a lot of companies can do it, but they can't commit to the content pillar in the beginning to get it rolling. Now, remind me of your question, James, and I'll tackle that.
Yeah, I was kind of curious what your thoughts were on how accepting this idea that the content has not been used up, when it's first distributed, and that both the ideas and the physical content itself can still be useful and used in other ways. Like, how does that change the way an organization can think about marketing tactics and or strategy?
I understand. And I think the best case examples, which is not, everyone's not going to get there. I realize that, is once you get that content pillar going, once you get buy-in from everyone, once you have people participating, internally repurposing becomes a part of the organization, right? Is naturally you have people maybe sharing that content pillar in their own way. Maybe you have people organically commenting it from your organization on maybe the podcast post on LinkedIn. Like, that stuff just balloons, right? Is everyone kind of feels that energy and moves forward with it. Now, the other case, which I think happens to so many marketers, and again, this space is marketing therapy for us. So if you have questions about this, please ask us, is you're just going to get a lot of pushback, right? From creating the content pillar, then trying to repurpose it. It's a lot of effort, a lot of time. I think always what works best is make sure you have the right stakeholders buy-in for what you're trying to do. And that can take many shapes and form. I think if you're a marketing director in-house, like, you have to get leadership buy-in to do this, right? That's going to be really hard. I think from the agency standpoint, working with the client, I think the best way to combat this is, again, not start with, we're doing this to repurpose and make micro content. You need to start with, we're doing this to solve your goal for this year, or we're doing this to do this part of the marketing plan. It just has to be that descriptive for your clients, because I think they're just not going to buy in if we don't. I think those would be my kind of two thoughts, James. I don't know if you have any thoughts about internally what this kind of does.
Yeah, I think the thing that I think of when I think of this is, when the idea is in your head that, or the mindset has shifted from like, the work that I've done is done, to the work that I've done is an evergreen asset that can be continually useful given the right circumstances, the right frame of mind, and then use it, blah, blah, blah. I think like you can start to change the way you think about all of the things you do. How can I perform subject matter expert interviews in a way that accomplishes the goal and makes them easily scannable, readable as a transcript? You might notice, like, when you're looking through transcripts, man, I ask really long-winded questions. I could do better about that. Like anything you do becomes training materials for the next person that needs to do this task. I mean, when you're recording things, when you're documenting things, which you're going to develop processes for doing all of that. If you focus on repurposing content, I think you can create all sorts of other types of like internally leverageable assets, like training documents, templates. I think that all of that stuff, like when we think about, we haven't talked a lot about like project management. I think we're going to soon, or process documentation or process refinement. We talked a little bit about playbooks. I mean, I think what the marketer wants is, if they don't know how they're going to do something, it's nice to have a template to either accept entirely, to see some parts and be like, I don't think that works. I don't think that that's something that's going to work for us, but just some sort of baseline. When you're repurposing content, when you're reusing things, when you're taking your work and seeing it as an evergreen asset all the time, you start to develop the muscle for doing things that are repeatable, and building a repeatable process out of a process that's built for good content, rather than, again, building a process for efficiency's sake and then finding out that it doesn't deliver good content. If you deliver the good content first, you can use, micro content and repurposement of content to kind of turn something that's creating quality into something that's also efficient. I think and then that mindset can extend through every activity in an organization. That's something that is not exclusive to marketing. That's not something that's exclusive to content marketing. Every avenue has, that has value everywhere. It's kind of the way it was a question that I was asking so that I could get to say that.
We can.
So that's kind of the way that I was thinking.
We can wrap up there, because I think that is an important point.
I
wanted you to mention it too. Is in general, repurposing is just an opportunity to get better, and take the tactics out of it. Is every opportunity you get to improve something, make it a little different, make it a little better, that's going to help you. That's going to help you grow. Now, for our listeners, I appreciate you, first off. Thank you for listening. If you want more tactical explanations, DM me. I can really explain how I repurpose this podcast in about 15 to 30 minutes to go on the platform. So I'm happy to offer those thoughts and insights. Mary, hope to see you soon. Hope to see you next week. We'll get you on board, get the trio back. And then, in a couple of weeks, we're going to try out a new format with 4 people. I'm just going to pitch that now. We'll see how it goes. But hey, we appreciate you. DM us, ask us questions, ask the why. We're here for you.